I'm Kirk Evans, Principal Premier Field Engineer for Microsoft. In this section, we'll take a look at the app hosting models in SharePoint 2013. SharePoint 2013 introduces the new app model. There are two high-level categories of apps, cloud-hosted apps and SharePoint-hosted apps. SharePoint-hosted apps are great for small, fully encapsulated apps that don't have large data storage requirements. They're manifested 100% within SharePoint, and any business logic must be implemented in custom code running in the client, the browser, as JavaScript or another client-based technology such as Silverlight. Each SharePoint app gets its own SP web, and each SharePoint hosted app that is installed is then isolated from other apps and thus is inherently multi-tenant. SharePoint cloud-hosted apps, on the other hand, are likely the more preferred model for creating apps. This module will go into the details around cloud-hosted apps. These apps enable the developer to leverage the full power of the web and select the infrastructure hosting you desire for your app. Because the developer is in full control, you can elect for your app to be fully multi-tenant friendly based on the way it is architected. Now for SharePoint hosted apps, we leverage an isolated SP web. You cannot use sandbox solutions with these, and you cannot deploy server-side code. All of the logic and code is written using client-side code. You can use libraries such as jQuery to make server-side calls from the client, but that isn't provided out of the box for you. So this is, again, all client-side code when you use the SharePoint hosted app with an SP web. Now the other type of app is a cloud-hosted app. And this is where the bulk of the application lives outside of SharePoint. Your app is hosted either in your own hosting, such as a private cloud or third party or even an IIS website, or it doesn't even have to be Microsoft technology. It can be running in a LAMP stack. So another choice for this would also be an Azure auto-hosted app that takes advantage of the auto-provisioning process in Windows Azure. So let's break down those examples a little bit more. For a provider-hosted app, customers can create their app in any technology stack and host on any platform that they choose. This could be a third-party cloud using PHP and developed using Eclipse. Developers would then create a SharePoint app package that would define how to extend SharePoint for use with the app. You'd use things like menu extensions, web parts, ribbon extensions, and you'd also assign app permissions using the OAuth app principal ID. Another choice is to use the Windows Azure auto provisioned app, an auto-hosted app. And in this scenario, we create a SharePoint app package, and that includes the SharePoint extensions and everything needed to deploy the application to Windows Azure automatically. It uses an existing subscription in Windows Azure configured by the tenant administrator. So when you configure your Office 365 tenant, you automatically get this Azure tenant that's associated with your Office 365 subscription. And this is a great option when you want to create an app that is inherently multi-tenant and purchased by customers to use with Office 365. Now when choosing your app hosting model, there are a few things that you'll need to compare to make a decision on what the target for your app will be. A SharePoint hosted app is scoped only to the SharePoint site where the app is installed. For cloud hosted apps, you have a lot of choice. An Azure auto hosted app is scoped to the site as well, but if it is a provider hosted app, then you can create a single infrastructure and all apps connect to the same infrastructure that's used by all installations of your app. So a SharePoint hosted app gets its own SP web. The Azure auto hosted app is associated with the site that it's provisioned to, where a provider hosted app can use one infrastructure that's used with all instances of the app for all of your customers. And that brings in a couple of other decisions that we'll need to take into account while we look at the architecture of SharePoint hosted versus cloud hosted. Now looking at the architecture, a SharePoint hosted app installs a copy to each web that it's installed to, where a cloud hosted app can be multi-tenant. A SharePoint hosted app, you're restricted to client-side technologies in the browser. For cloud-hosted apps, you can leverage the full stack of the platform that you choose. And this might, again, be your own IIS server or a site running in Azure, or even a non-Microsoft technology such as Java or an application built with the LAMP stack. For server-side code, you can do whatever you want in a cloud-hosted app, but for SharePoint apps, you're restricted to using client-side technologies. And that kind of brings in the storage, because for SharePoint hosted apps, data is stored in lists and document libraries. A cloud-hosted app allows you to choose whatever data storage you want. Perhaps your data storage might be a database or in SQL Azure or even in a MySQL database somewhere. So you are in full control of the architecture and of the data storage for your app. The key limitation though for a SharePoint hosted app is that there is no server-side code. For cloud-hosted apps, the limitation is that you need to host the app. So there may be a cost associated with building the solution on your infrastructure of choice. The key, though, here is that you get to choose on what you want to do for your app. There are a lot of benefits to this cloud-hosted model. You're not tied to any SharePoint limitations, and your application runs outside SharePoint. It means you can take advantage of technologies such as ASP.NET MVC or other technologies such as Node.js that Azure supports. You can use other facilities in Azure, such as long-running processes, service bus, blobs, tables, and it's not just Azure. You can also take advantage of technologies outside the Microsoft stack. All of this is available when you use provider-hosted apps. Another option is to use a Windows Azure auto-hosted app. Now, these are only available with Office 365 apps, where the Azure tenant is provisioned with your Office 365 tenant. While apps can take advantage of the full power and services offered in Windows Azure, those apps built as Windows Azure auto-hosted apps can only leverage the websites and SQL Azure database support using the automatic provisioning features. Apps communicate with SharePoint using open standards such as OData services in SharePoint 2013 to send and receive data from SharePoint. Security is provided by obtaining permissions using OAuth. Another module will go deeper on how to use OAuth for app authentication. So let's look at some of the design considerations while building your apps. When building cloud-hosted apps, there are three things that you need to pay attention to. The three design considerations when building apps include the isolation model, multi-tenant designs, and also how would you make cross-domain calls. Isolation of app instances, specifically the data and the experience, is critical in cloud-hosted apps. Consider two beverage companies who each have a secret formula for their product, and it would be very bad if they could see each other's data. So this new app model enables developers to design apps using the architecture of your choice, but that also means that you'll need to take into account things like multi-tenancy to make sure that you separate customers' data and processing. Or for Azure auto-hosted app, each app gets its own instance in Windows Azure and is completely isolated from other customers. In a true multi-tenancy app, such as a provider-hosted app where you build on your own infrastructure that's shared among many customers, the separation between tenants will be handled by your business logic and your application design rather than by maintaining separate instances of the app. And this is an important point to consider in the design of cloud-hosted apps. When an app leverages a multi-tenant design, you need to take special care when architecting the application. There are several things that you'll need to consider. First, you'll need to understand how to manage the tenants and the user authentication and authorization for each client. You'll also need to take care of partitioning the storage, meaning keeping each tenant's data isolated from other tenants. Again, going back to the two beverage companies that have their secret recipe that you don't want each other to be able to see by virtue of being stored in your app. Not only do you need to partition the storage, but you also have to create partitioning data access logic to ensure that the tenants can't access each other's data and shared data access. So maybe you have a requirement where you can't even have a shared process between the tenants. And that brings up runtime isolation. If you have two tenants running in the same process, perhaps you don't want shared business logic to even be available to isolate the processing of data from a partitioned database. So you may need to not only partition storage and the data access logic, but there may be additional requirements to partition the actual runtime of the app itself. You also need to account for a scalable infrastructure using a stateless design. And not only do we need to take into account the storage, the logic, and the app isolation, but you'll also need to understand the compliance requirements for your app. Even for small and medium-sized businesses, it's a very involved process to get certifications required for business data when building your own data center for retaining customer data in a hosted model. It can be a very involved process to get these certifications required to retain customer data in your own infrastructure. Now, this could be an advantage when looking at the hosting options. Maybe you choose an Azure auto-hosted app because the app is multi-tenant by default with no shared logic and already includes partitioned storage. The Azure team is working to get those certifications, so it's something that you wouldn't have to worry about in the design of your architecture. SharePoint apps request a set of permissions when provisioned in a SharePoint site. Those permissions are read, write, manage, and full control. And we map those kind of to the permission levels of read, contribute, design, and full control. But unlike with user permissions, we don't have the ability to make fine-grained changes to the app. As the app is installed, it either is granted permissions or the app is simply not installed. And we'll cover application permissions a little bit more throughout the rest of these modules. SharePoint 2013 utilizes OAuth, which is used to grant app permissions to content within SharePoint. And the app permissions are scoped at lists, site, and site collection scopes. SharePoint apps have an app manifest.xml file. And this tells SharePoint everything it needs to know about the app, including the title, the version, even the start page element, including permissions and any other settings for your app. In the case of cloud-hosted apps that are created as Windows Azure auto-hosted apps, the Azure project configuration needs 3 settings in the configuration file. These properties are managed by SharePoint when it creates and deploys the app to Azure. Your app will communicate with SharePoint for things like data access and to perform certain functions such as creating lists. All app communication happens using the client-side object model, or REST, using the new OData services in SharePoint 2013. But before that happens, your app must be granted permission, and this happens using the new OAuth support. Now, because apps and their pages run outside of SharePoint, and you need to call back into SharePoint from the client side to talk to the data, if nothing is done, it will cause a problem as cross-domain calls, otherwise known as cross-site scripting, are blocked by default. This is not an issue, obviously, when communication is initiated from server-side code, as there are not cross-domain call limitations with server-side code. Now, to address this, SharePoint has implemented a cross-domain JavaScript library that makes it easier for developers to work with their application from the client side. Now, the pages and apps can use the sp.requestexecutor.js library, which uses a proxy page that is hosted inside of SharePoint that will route the call to the correct place within the SharePoint site. This is covered in the SharePoint hosted apps material in this course because that's a common scenario for that architecture. Now, as web applications grow in popularity, web developers have become more aware of significant limitations. Browsers do not allow page elements to interact with more than one domain, and allowing that interaction would expose both users and servers to cross-domain attacks. So modern apps need to be able to merge information from different sources to create things like mashups. And the solution for that in SharePoint 2013 is to use the sp.requestexecutor.js library. It's located in the layouts directory, and this allows you to make calls from your app back into SharePoint. And the way that it happens is that you'll use this sp.requestexecutor.js library, and it'll create an iframe in the page for your app. And by using that iframe, then that allows secure communication, point-to-point trusted communication between your app and SharePoint. It uses a hidden iframe along with post messaging and a proxy page, the appwebproxy.aspx, which is an ASP.NET page, to route calls to SharePoint. And the routing happens client-side as opposed to server-side. In this module, we reviewed the app hosting models and called out some benefits and limitations for each model. You'll need to consider these when choosing a hosting architecture. We discussed things like the multi-tenancy requirements and security requirements for your app. And we also discussed some considerations when communicating between your app and SharePoint. And we showed some ways to address those challenges.